Welcome to the lecture. I'm Cynthia McAllister. In this lecture, we'll continue to explore more deeply the way that the classroom environment supports learning. In this video, we'll take a closer look at how social intentions, those of the learner and those of the people who control the environment, play a role in supporting growth and change. Another way of looking at the environment and the role that it plays in learning is to more deeply examine the person-environment relationship. We've learned that development is an aspect of the relationship between the individual and the environment, not a state of being located exclusively within the individual. In other words, skills must be understood as a state of reciprocal adjustment between the student and the environment. Richard Schwader's analytic framework for describing the person-environment relationship can be used to understand how student-environment alignment and maladjustment can be explained. One dimension of a situation is the degree to which the person's intentions, their goals, beliefs, and desires, are expressed in a situation. Situations are positive when the context supports or amplifies personal intentionality, and negative when it diminishes, opposes, or interferes with it. Another dimension of the relationship is the degree of agency that a person may exercise. A situation is active when a person creates or selects their own intentional world, and reactive when others create or select an intentional world for the person, or passive when a person finds him or herself in an intentional world created by others, for others or themselves. So I've created this chart to help you understand the relationship between the person and the environment by giving some examples. In the first column, in the first row, we see an example of an active, positive person-environment situation. In the example of a child playing make-believe restaurant and serving a playmate pretend pancakes. In the first column, in the second row, an active, negative situation. The child is choosing to go to the timeout area after losing his temper with a classmate. Pause the lecture and take a few seconds to sketch out the diagram. Next, practice using the diagram. I've provided some images of person-environment relationships. As you look at each image, try to place it on the diagram. Ask yourself, what's the relationship between the person's intentions and the way in which the situation is supporting or mitigating these intentions? Maladaptive or challenging behavior is a predictable adaptive response in individuals who, when confronted with stressful or uncomfortable situations, respond in undesirable ways. The key to establishing desired behaviors is to adjust the learning situation to better fit the needs of the student and the objectives of the learning situation. For example, if a student demonstrates a pattern of challenging behaviors in situations that are negative reactive, the situation can be adjusted to minimize its negative reactive aspects and magnify negative active or positive reactive aspects in order to help the student better adapt. So breach. Take a minute to think about these relationships in the context of your own life and your teaching. Are there things you love to do and seek situations where you can do that thing? On the opposite side of the framework, are there things you hate to do but find yourself forced into those situations? Do you have students who you know need to do things they must do in order to learn but refuse to do them? Take a minute and fit these examples into the framework just presented. The learning cultures formats recognize that learning is a constant process of shifting states. To learn or achieve something worthwhile, for a person who starts out knowing nothing about that particular thing, Achievement will mean the child must progress through some of the person-environment domains described above. The formats are designed to create situations that maximize learning potential for students. They draw the student into the orbit of social routines and practices where peers enforce social norms, thereby forcing the student to self-regulate to group expectations. Over time, through participation in the formats, problematic or limited thoughts or behaviors become normalized and better align in the student environment situation in order to achieve learning objectives. So, how do we organize environments for learning? Traditionally, classrooms were organized for teaching, for the transfer of knowledge and the control of behavior. This environment is upturned within the learning cultures model, where the environment is organized to support students in cultivating personal intentions and independent competencies that align with established learning standards. So the investment of time at the beginning of the year in setting up the classroom environment in a way that promotes the kinds of changes and patterns of growth you desire is critically important. The classroom environment in a learning cultures classroom needs to be substantively changed. Also, learning cultures built on the understanding that the acquisition of certain types of intentions, such as autonomy and independence, are best supported when they have a chance to develop over a sustained period of time. This is why consistency and coherence in the way that environments are organized is fundamental to the learning cultures classroom. With high levels of consistency, students can rely on the fact that they may exercise agency across the many dimensions of learning within the school. They aren't required to relearn different forms of promoted action, new standards of conduct, or boundaries of freedom in different teachers' classrooms. Teachers all participate in creating environments that are consistent in ways that intentionality and agency are supported. So here you are, a blank canvas. Here's a rendering of a classroom. Desks are not in rows, rather students are gathered in the meeting area, waiting for direction from you. How will you structure their zone of free movement and possible action? So breach. Isn't this kind of overwhelming? The sense of being overwhelmed is something that most new teachers feel when they face the blank canvas of their first classroom. Every aspiring teacher holds visions of possibility for students to find activities in the room that engage and challenge them. But when you face the empty classroom in the middle of the summer, with polished floors and boxes and chairs piled on desktops, the possibilities are almost heart-stopping. This section of the lecture is developed to ease your angst, providing a how-to guide to set up a learning cultures classroom. I recommend that you review this section with a group of colleagues and together plan how you can collaborate in setting up your rooms. A learning cultures elementary school in the South Bronx uses their lunch and learn period in the beginning of the year to put together assessment binders. A high school in Manhattan uses a PD day for teachers to work together in classrooms to set up learning environments, calling the event Classroom Barn Raising. Get together with your colleagues and dedicate collective time to supporting one another and creating supportive learning environments for your students. Here are suggested activities. Copy the classroom environment rubric. Use the rubric as an outline of elements you need to include in the classroom environment. Make a to-do list, as well as a to-get list. If you're working with colleagues, divvy up the responsibilities so that things to do and get is distributed evenly and the work gets done efficiently. Set up inter-classroom observations with colleagues. Use the rubric to give feedback to one another about what still needs attention. So here are some concluding thoughts. In her now classic essay, Dilemmas of a Progressive Black Educator, Lisa Delpit wrote about the quandary many of us face when we're learning to manage the environments of our classrooms to promote students' achievement of learning targets. She wrote, "Many people told me I was a good teacher. I had an open classroom. I had learning stations. I had children write books and stories to share. I provided games and used weaving to teach math and fine motor skills. I threw out all of the desks and added carpeted open learning areas. I was doing what I had learned, and it worked. Well, at least it worked for some of the children. My white students zoomed ahead. They worked hard at the learning stations. They did amazing things with books and writing. My black students played the games. they learned how to weave, and they threw the books around the learning stations. They practiced karate moves on the new carpets. Some of them even learned how to read, but none of them as quickly as my white students. I was doing the same thing for all my students. What was the problem? So, that's a good question. What do you think? What was the problem? Hopefully, by now you're beginning to understand that the alchemy of learning is a concoction of circumstance and personal will. The scientific paradigms available when Delpit wrote this article led teachers to believe that learning was a simple matter of creating supportive learning environments and inviting students to do as they wished. This idea was reinforced in child development and teacher education through the theories of Piaget and others. We as teachers were led to believe that learning was natural. But just as the adage goes, you can bring a horse to water, but you can't make him drink. You can buy new carpets and computers and Lincoln Logs, but kids have intentions, all their own. They'll use carpets for dances and karate kicks, computers to shop for sneakers, and Lincoln Logs as race cars, because that's what they're inclined to do. Even, in a sense, what they're supposed to do. It's up to us as their teachers to help them learn otherwise, to use these things in other ways. The psychology books written back in the 80s suggested that A, learning is a matter of just letting nature take its course provided the right environment, or B, given the correct dose of explicit instruction, you can trigger a student's internal cognitive mechanisms and they'll learn what's required. That would be very nice, but that's not how the processes of the human mind work. We now know that social norms play a hugely important role in shaping what people do with the things in their surroundings, what memories they make of their actions, and what possibilities they find in using things in different and more or less useful ways. And an important part of learning the things that are required is knowing when and how to use them in ways that our culture dictates they are supposed to be used. In other words, students come to school from the broadest swaths of the cloth of humanity, where they have already learned how to do things with the stuff of their worlds. Some kids will have had exposure to school-type artifacts. Bedtime story rituals will have helped them learn how to use books in sanctioned ways, and they'll more quickly achieve desired outcomes. But some kids will not have had the same exposure. They'll need different experiences in the classroom. Now, 30 years after Delpit wrote her essay, we have a better understanding about why, when a diverse collection of students enter the classroom, some are better able to take advantage of learning opportunities than others. Hopefully, this lecture helped you better understand the role that the environment plays in learning, and helped you see how you can take steps to ensure the learning environment effectively meets learning objectives. So, let's summarize and review. In this lecture, you learned about the importance of the classroom environment as a factor in learning and development. You learned about scientific concepts that explain the environment. We reviewed the zone of proximal development and tried to elaborate the complexity of the zone by exploring two additional concepts, the zone of free movement and the zone of promoted action. Take a minute and think about what you remember about these three zones. Brainstorm what you learned. Try to list the reasons the classroom environment is such an important factor, and explain why. Discuss your response with a colleague. Then refer back to the lecture to review what you might have overlooked. Come back to your notes and revise them. In this lecture, I also presented strategies you can use to make your classroom learning environment a rich learning resource. Again, list the strategies you can recall, discuss them with a colleague, then refer back to the lecture in order to revise your notes.